The auditorium hummed with anticipation. Students sat in neat rows, their uniforms crisp and spotless, their conversations a low buzz of excitement. Every year, the Wellington Academy Award for Academic Excellence was the highlight of the academic calendar. The awards ceremony wasn't just about prestige, it was about legacy, a marker of the brightest minds destined for Ivy League universities and future success. Emma Johnson sat in the middle row, her back straight, her heart pounding in her chest. She smoothed her navy skirt nervously. Her friends, Clara and Miguel, sat on either side of her, both whispering words of encouragement. "You've got this, Emma," Clara said, her hazel eyes sparkling. "You've been working for this all year. There's no way anyone else could win." Emma gave her a weak smile, clutching her folder tighter. She had prepared her speech the night before, staying up late to perfect every word. For years, she had envisioned herself standing on that stage, holding the golden plaque, looking out at the sea of students and teachers with pride. As the principal, Mr. Harris, approached the podium, the room fell silent. His voice boomed through the microphone, full of authority. "Good morning, everyone. Today, we honor the finest among us, the students who represent the very best of Wellington Academy. Their hard work, intellect, and leadership are what make this school shine." Emma sat taller, her heart swelling. She glanced at Clara, who gave her a confident nod. Miguel grinned and whispered, "They'd be idiots not to pick you." Mr. Harris continued, "And now, the nominees for the Wellington Academy Award for Academic Excellence. These students have exemplified our values: diligence, integrity, and achievement. Let's give them a warm round of applause." Emma's chest tightened as the nominees' names were read aloud. First, there was Stephen Carter, the basketball team captain with good grades but not nearly the academic rigor Emma had demonstrated. Then came Ashley Walters, a diligent student but one whose grades trailed behind Emma's. Name after name was announced, but Emma's name never came. She felt her stomach drop. Her palms began to sweat. Clara frowned, leaning toward her. "Wait, did they skip you?" Miguel's jaw tightened. "That has to be a mistake." Finally, when the last name was called, and it wasn't hers, Emma's heart shattered. A wave of murmurs rippled through the students. Everyone knew she was supposed to be a nominee. She was at the top of every leaderboard, leading clubs, excelling in debates, and mentoring younger students. It wasn't just an oversight, it was an insult. The applause died down as Mr. Harris began announcing the winner. Emma didn't hear it. She was too stunned to focus, staring blankly at her clasped hands. Clara grabbed her arm. "You need to say something." Emma's throat was dry, and words escaped her. The humiliation was unbearable. The ceremony blurred around her, the clapping, the speeches, and the celebration of others. By the time the students filed out of the auditorium, Emma felt like a ghost among them. "Emma?" Clara called as they walked down the hallway. "What the hell was that?" "You've been robbed." Miguel added, "You need to talk to Mr. Harris. There's no way you weren't on that list." Emma shook her head, her voice trembling. "I don't understand. I've done everything. My grades, my projects, my leadership roles. How could they just ignore me?" "It's not just an oversight," Clara said, her tone sharp. "Someone made sure your name wasn't on there." Before Emma could respond, a familiar voice interrupted. Margaret White, the head of the history department, approached with her usual air of superiority. Her sharp blue eyes scanned Emma with a look of disdain, and her lips curled into a condescending smile. "Miss Johnson," Margaret said, her voice syrupy sweet. "You look upset. Is something the matter?" Emma bit back her frustration, her hands trembling. "Yes, actually. I wasn't included in the list of nominees for the Academic Excellence Award. I'm just surprised." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Surprised, are you? While you've done well in your classes, these awards aren't just about grades. They're about character." Emma's cheeks flushed. "Character? I've worked harder than anyone in this school. I lead the student council, volunteer at community events, and..." Margaret cut her off with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Hard work is admirable, Miss Johnson, but these decisions are made by a panel. It's not always about being the loudest voice in the room. Clara stepped forward, her voice rising. That's ridiculous. Emma is the most deserving person in this school, and you know it. Margaret's eyes narrowed. I suggest you mind your tone, Miss Blake. If you have concerns, you're welcome to take them to the administration. She turned back to Emma. But I suggest you focus on areas where you can truly excel. Perhaps leadership within your community is a better fit. Emma stared at her, her blood boiling. The implication was clear. Margaret didn't see her as worthy, not because of her achievements, but because of her identity. After Margaret walked away, Miguel muttered, "She's such a snake." She did this, didn't she? Emma's jaw tightened. I don't have proof, but I'm not letting this slide. If they think they can erase me, they're wrong. Clara nodded. We've got your back, Emma. Let's figure this out. For the rest of the day, whispers followed Emma wherever she went. Some students expressed shock at her exclusion. Others smirked, clearly enjoying her downfall. Teachers avoided meeting her gaze. By the time the final bell rang, Emma was emotionally drained, but her resolve was stronger than ever. That evening, she sat at her desk, staring at the awards list in the school bulletin. Her speech, carefully written in her notebook, mocked her from the corner of the desk. Clara and Miguel had texted her relentlessly, brainstorming ways to challenge the decision, but Emma knew this wasn't just about the award anymore. This was about being seen, respected, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. The next day began with a heavy fog that mirrored Emma's mood. She arrived at school early, clutching her books tightly, trying to avoid the stares she knew would follow her. As she walked through the main corridor, snippets of whispered conversations floated to her ears. Can you believe she thought she'd get nominated? Guess she's not as perfect as everyone says. I heard Mrs. White had something to do with it. Her jaw clenched, and she kept her head down. She turned the corner to her locker, only to find a group of students gathered there. Stephen Carter leaned against the adjacent lockers, flanked by his friends, a smug grin on his face. Hey, Johnson, he called out as she approached. Tough break yesterday. Guess they finally realized you're not as special as you think. Emma froze. Her chest tightened, but she forced herself to keep her voice steady. Excuse me? Stephen chuckled, his tone dripping with mock sympathy. Don't take it too hard. Not everyone can be a winner. Maybe next year. Next year? Emma snapped, stepping closer. I've earned that nomination more than anyone. You know it, I know it, everyone knows it. His smirk widened. Sure, but let's be real. Do you really think the school is going to put someone like you at the top? Maybe you should stick to community service or something. Leave the big awards to people who belong here. Emma's stomach churned as she realized what he meant. Her voice trembled, but she stood her ground. People like me have earned their place here. And I'm not going anywhere. Stephen shrugged as his friends laughed. Whatever helps you sleep at night. The group sauntered off, leaving Emma standing there, her fists clenched. Clara appeared moments later, her face flushed with anger. I swear, Stephen is the worst, she spat. How can he say that to you and get away with it? Emma sighed, opening her locker. Because he knows he can. People like him don't get called out. People like me do. Clara put a hand on Emma's shoulder. We'll make them listen, but you have to fight back. Emma hesitated. Fighting back meant more stares, more whispers, more humiliation. But she was already the target. What more could they do to her? Later that morning, Emma sat through Mrs. White's history class, feeling the teacher's gaze linger on her longer than necessary. Margaret White's voice was smooth but condescending as she lectured on the great legacies of early American leaders. Emma's mind drifted, her frustration simmering beneath the surface. Miss Johnson, Margaret's voice suddenly snapped, pulling Emma from her thoughts. Since you seem distracted, perhaps you'd like to answer this. Who was John Wellington's most trusted advisor during the school's founding? Emma blinked. She knew the answer. She'd written an entire essay on it for an academic competition, but Margaret's tone made her second-guess herself. Charles Atwood, she replied cautiously. Margaret's lips curved into a thin smile. Incorrect. It was Nathaniel Crane. Perhaps you should pay closer attention. A ripple of laughter spread through the class. Emma's cheeks burned as she stared down at her notebook. Clara, sitting beside her, glared at Margaret but said nothing. When the class ended, Emma stayed behind, determined to confront her teacher. As the last student filed out, she approached Margaret's desk. "Mrs. White," Emma began, her voice firm, "I'd like to talk about the academic excellence nominations." Margaret looked up from her papers, feigning surprise. "Oh? I thought we already discussed this yesterday." "We didn't," Emma said sharply. "You brushed me off. I need to understand why I wasn't considered. My academic record is impeccable. I've outperformed most of the nominees." Margaret set her pen down, her expression turning icy. "Miss Johnson, I understand you're upset, but as I explained, these decisions aren't just about numbers. They're about representing the values of Wellington Academy. And I don't represent those values?" Emma asked, her voice rising. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Frankly, no. You're outspoken, and while your grades are excellent, your attitude leaves much to be desired. You've challenged authority on multiple occasions. That's not the type of role model we're looking for." Emma's heart pounded. "So, standing up for myself disqualifies me? That's what this is about." Margaret leaned back in her chair, her tone dripping with condescension. "This is about understanding your place, Miss Johnson. Not everyone can be a leader. Perhaps you'd be better suited for other opportunities." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She nodded stiffly and left the room, her anger bubbling over. As she walked down the hallway, she passed a display case filled with old photographs and awards. Her eyes caught a plaque dedicated to John Wellington, the school's founder. Something about his gaze in the portrait struck her, a quiet defiance, a resilience. It reminded her of herself. That afternoon, Emma met with Clara and Miguel in the library. Miguel was pacing, his face flushed with frustration. "This is insane," he said. "We all know why Margaret White doesn't want you winning that award. She doesn't see you as equal to the other students." Clara nodded. "She's been like this for years. Remember when she shot down Marcus's paper last year for being too focused on race?" Emma sat at the table, staring at her hands. "Even if that's true, what can I do? Margaret's one of the most influential teachers here. No one's going to take my side." Miguel slammed his hand on the table, earning a glare from the librarian. "You can't just let her win. We need proof, something that shows she's targeting you unfairly." Clara pulled out her laptop. "What if we dig into the nomination process? Maybe there's something shady going on." Emma hesitated. She hated the idea of causing more trouble for herself, but her friends were right. This wasn't just about her. It was about standing up to a system that had let people like Margaret White thrive for far too long. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's do it. But we have to be smart about this. If we're wrong." "We're not wrong," Clara interrupted. "And we're not stopping until we get justice." As they began their research, Emma felt a flicker of hope amidst the humiliation. She wasn't alone in this fight, and she was ready to prove she belonged. The quiet hum of the school library provided a strange comfort as Emma, Clara, and Miguel huddled over a growing stack of documents. It had been 2 days since Emma's confrontation with Mrs. White, and their investigation was gaining traction. The tension in the air was palpable as Clara scrolled through archived records on her laptop, while Miguel flipped through old yearbooks and reports. "There's something weird here," Clara said, narrowing her eyes at the screen. "Look at this. Years ago, Wellington Academy used to openly honor students from diverse backgrounds. There are mentions of awards for community impact, inclusion, but that all stopped in the 1960s. Miguel leaned over her shoulder. "Why would they erase that? This school loves to brag about tradition." Emma felt a knot form in her stomach. "It's not just about tradition. It's about control. They only want to highlight what makes them look good, like they've always been perfect." Miguel let out a frustrated sigh. "We need something bigger. Something that proves Margaret White is actively manipulating the system." Emma nodded, but before she could reply, a loud thud interrupted them. Stephen Carter had slammed a stack of books onto the nearby table. He smirked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Still trying to make yourself feel better, Johnson," he said. "Face it, you lost." No amount of digging through history books is going to change that. Emma's blood boiled, but she refused to rise to his taunts. "You'd better hope I don't find what I'm looking for, Stephen," she said evenly. "Because if I do, everyone will know how undeserving you really are." Stephen's smirk faltered for a moment before he laughed. "Keep dreaming. No one's going to take your side against Mrs. White. She's practically untouchable." Clara stood abruptly, her hands on her hips. "You're just scared because you know she's right." Stephen rolled his eyes. "Whatever. Good luck with your little conspiracy theory." He left, but the tension lingered in the air. Emma exhaled slowly, trying to shake off the encounter. "He's right about one thing," she muttered. "People like Mrs. White are untouchable unless we find something undeniable." Later that day, Emma received an unexpected message from Mrs. White herself. The note, delivered by one of the office aides, was written in the teacher's neat, precise handwriting. "Miss Johnson, I expect to see you in my office at 3:30. Let's discuss your concerns." Clara frowned when Emma showed her the note. "That's a trap if I've ever seen one." Miguel agreed. "You don't have to go. She's just going to try to intimidate you." Emma hesitated, but she knew she couldn't avoid this confrontation forever. "I'll go," she said. "But I'm not backing down." At exactly 3:30, Emma knocked on the heavy wooden door of Mrs. White's office. "Come in," came the familiar, clipped voice. Emma entered, her heart pounding. The office was as immaculate as its owner. Bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes, a polished desk free of clutter, and a faint scent of lavender in the air. Margaret White sat behind her desk, her piercing blue eyes fixed on Emma. "Miss Johnson," she said, gesturing to the chair in front of her. "Sit." Emma obeyed, gripping the edge of the chair as Mrs. White regarded her with an air of condescension. "I've noticed you've been quite vocal lately," Margaret began. "Rallying your friends, stirring up unnecessary drama. That's not the behavior I expect from a student of Wellington Academy." Emma's voice was steady, though her hands trembled in her lap. "I'm not stirring up drama. I'm trying to understand why I wasn't nominated for an award I've worked hard for." Margaret's lips twitched in a humorless smile. "Perhaps you should spend less time questioning authority and more time focusing on your studies. Wellington Academy values humility and respect." Emma's patience snapped. "Humility? Respect? Is that what you call erasing people's accomplishments because they don't fit your narrative?" Margaret's expression hardened. "Be very careful, Miss Johnson. Accusations like that can have serious consequences." Emma leaned forward, her voice sharp. "The only thing I'm guilty of is exposing the truth. I've seen the records, Mrs. White. This school erased its history of inclusion, and people like you are making sure it stays buried." For a moment, Margaret's mask of composure slipped, and Emma saw something flicker in her eyes. Fear, perhaps, or anger. "You don't know what you're talking about," Margaret said, her voice colder than ever. "And if you continue down this path, it will not end well for you." Emma stood, her pulse racing. "That's where you're wrong. I'm not afraid of you. And I'm not stopping until everyone knows the truth." She walked out of the office, her head held high, even as her hands shook. That evening, Clara and Miguel met Emma at her house. Miguel was practically buzzing with energy. "Okay, I've got something," he said, pulling out a folder. "I found a yearbook from 1963. Look at this." He opened the folder to reveal a black and white photo of a young black student standing next to John Wellington's portrait. Beneath the photo was a caption, "Honoring Excellence, Wellington Academy's first legacy scholar." Emma stared at the photo, her heart pounding. Legacy scholar? What does that mean? Clara scrolled through her laptop. "Hold on, here it is." The Legacy Scholarship was created to honor students who were direct descendants of the school's founder. It was meant to promote equity and recognize diverse contributions to the school's history. Emma's breath caught. But they don't do that anymore. Why? Miguel flipped another page. Because they buried it. Look at this. There's no mention of the scholarship after 1968. That's when the administration changed. Clara added. And guess who was on the board during that time? Margaret White's father. Emma's eyes widened. The pieces were falling into place. She's not just upholding the system. Her family helped create it. That's why she hates me. I'm not just a threat to her control. I'm a reminder of what they've tried to erase. Miguel grinned. We've got her now. This is exactly the proof we need. Emma nodded, her resolve hardening. It's time to make this public. No more hiding. No more letting people like Margaret White control the narrative. The three friends looked at each other, united in their determination. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, Emma felt like she had the upper hand. The next morning, Emma entered the school with a renewed sense of purpose. The halls were buzzing with activity, but the whispers seemed louder today. News of her confrontation with Margaret White had spread like wildfire. Students glanced her way, some curious, others skeptical. Clara and Miguel joined her near her locker, their expressions tense but determined. Are you ready for this? Clara asked, her voice low. Emma nodded. I don't have a choice. If I stay quiet, they win. Miguel handed her a thick folder filled with copies of the documents they'd found. We've got everything we need to prove Margaret's bias and expose what the school's been hiding. But getting people to listen is the hard part. Emma's jaw tightened. Then we make them listen. The first step was to rally support. Clara and Miguel spread the word among their classmates, sharing snippets of the documents to spark interest. By lunchtime, a small group had gathered in the courtyard, eager to hear Emma speak. She stood on a bench, clutching the folder, her heart racing as dozens of eyes turned to her. Most of you know me, she began, her voice steady despite the nerves threatening to overwhelm her. I've worked hard at this school, just like many of you. But yesterday, I realized that hard work isn't enough when the system is rigged against you. A murmur ran through the crowd. I wasn't nominated for the Academic Excellence Award, not because I didn't earn it, but because people like Margaret White don't think I belong here. And she's not just one bad apple. This school has a history of erasing people like me, people who don't fit their narrow definition of excellence. Emma held up one of the documents. This is a yearbook from 1963. It shows the first recipient of a legacy scholarship, a Black student whose contributions to Wellington Academy were celebrated. But that scholarship was erased. The school buried its history of inclusion, and Margaret White's family was part of that cover-up. Gasps and whispers erupted among the students. Clara stepped forward, her voice loud and clear. They don't want you to know this, because it threatens their control. But it's time we hold them accountable. Miguel added, this isn't just about Emma. It's about all of us. If we let them get away with this, what's stopping them from silencing the rest of us? Emma took a deep breath, her voice firm. We deserve better. I'm not backing down, and I hope you won't either. The crowd broke into applause. Some students cheered, while others nodded in agreement. But not everyone was convinced. Stephen Carter stood at the edge of the group, his arms crossed, shaking his head. This is just a pity party, he called out. You're making excuses because you didn't get what you wanted. Grow up. Emma locked eyes with him. This isn't about me, Stephen. It's about a system that rewards privilege and punishes people who don't fit the mold. If you can't see that, maybe you're part of the problem. Stephen scoffed but didn't respond. By the end of the day, Emma's movement had gained traction. Several students began sharing their own stories of unfair treatment, while others dug through old records, looking for more evidence of bias. But as momentum grew, so did the resistance. Emma was called into the principal's office that afternoon. Mr. Harris sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable. Margaret White stood beside him, her arms crossed, her face a mask of icy calm. Miss Johnson, Mr. Harris began, we've been hearing concerning reports about your recent behavior. Behavior? Emma asked, her voice steady. You mean exposing the truth? Margaret's lips curled into a smirk. Spreading baseless accusations and creating chaos among the student body is not acceptable. Emma placed the folder on the desk, flipping it open to reveal the documents. These aren't accusations. They're facts. This school erased its history of inclusion, and you've allowed it to continue. Mr. Harris's expression wavered for a moment before he cleared his throat. Miss Johnson, while I appreciate your passion, this isn't the appropriate way to address your concerns. You're disrupting the school environment. Emma's voice rose. I'm disrupting the environment because the environment is broken. How can you stand by and let this happen? Margaret stepped forward, her voice icy. Enough. This conversation is over. If you continue this behavior, there will be consequences. Emma stood her ground, her fists clenched. The only consequence will be for you when everyone learns the truth. She turned and walked out, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. That evening, Emma, Clara, and Miguel organized a meeting in the school auditorium. Over 100 students showed up, along with a handful of parents and alumni who had heard about the movement. Emma stood on the stage, her voice steady as she shared the documents and told the stories that had been hidden for decades. One by one, students came forward, sharing their experiences of bias and exclusion. Clara spoke passionately about the need for change, while Miguel emphasized the importance of accountability. As the meeting gained momentum, an unexpected figure entered the room, Mrs. White. She stood at the back, her face a mask of disdain, but Emma noticed the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. When Emma finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. Students chanted her name, their voices echoing off the walls. Margaret turned and left without a word, but Emma knew the battle was far from over. The next morning, Emma received an email from an alumni association member who had attended the meeting. Attached was a scanned copy of a letter written by John Wellington himself, a letter that outlined his vision for the school as a place of inclusion and opportunity for all. As Emma read the words, her chest tightened. This was the missing piece, the undeniable proof of the school's true legacy. She forwarded it to Clara and Miguel, her fingers trembling with excitement. "This is it," she said aloud. "This is how we win." With the letter in hand, Emma prepared for the next step in her fight. Margaret White and the administration wouldn't go down without a fight, but neither would she. The truth was out, and Emma was ready to see it through to the end. The auditorium was packed. Students, parents, faculty, and alumni filled the rows, their murmurs creating a low buzz of anticipation. At the front of the room, the school board members sat stiffly, their faces a mix of tension and unease. Principal Harris stood at the podium, clearly uncomfortable as he shuffled his notes. Emma sat in the first row, the scanned letter from John Wellington clasped in her hands. Clara and Miguel flanked her, their expressions resolute. This was it, the moment everything would come to light. Mr. Harris cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for gathering here today. We are here to address recent concerns brought forth by our students regarding the administration's practices and the legacy of Wellington Academy." Before he could continue, a voice called out from the back. "Let Emma speak." The crowd erupted into cheers, students chanting her name. Mr. Harris hesitated, his grip tightening on the podium. Finally, he nodded. "Miss Johnson, you may address the assembly." Emma stood, her legs trembling but her resolve strong. She walked to the stage, the folder in her hands feeling heavier than ever. As she stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. She took a deep breath. "For as long as I've been a student at Wellington Academy, I've been told this school values excellence, integrity, and hard work. But in the past few weeks, I've learned that those values only apply to some of us." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "When I wasn't nominated for the Academic Excellence Award, I questioned why. My friends and I uncovered something far bigger than just one award. We found proof that Wellington Academy has systematically erased its history of inclusion and diversity, replacing it with a narrative that suits those in power." She held up the letter from John Wellington. "This is a letter written by John Wellington himself, the founder of our school. In it, he describes his vision for Wellington Academy as a place where all students, regardless of race, background, or status, could thrive. But that vision was betrayed." Emma's voice cracked, but she pressed on. The Legacy Scholarship, which honored students descended from John Wellington, was discontinued in the 1960s. The school's history of celebrating diversity was buried, and people like Mrs. Margaret White ensured it stayed that way. Gasps echoed through the room. Margaret, seated near the board members, stiffened, her face pale. Emma met the crowd's gaze, her eyes blazing with determination. This isn't just about the past. It's about the present. It's about ensuring that students like me are no longer overlooked, silenced, or dismissed. We deserve better. And I'm not going to stop until this school becomes what it was meant to be, a place for everyone. The room erupted into applause. Students stood, cheering and chanting Emma's name. Parents and alumni joined in, their voices filling the space with a sense of unity and purpose. The fallout was swift. The school board launched an investigation into the administration's practices, and within days, Margaret White was suspended pending review. Her influence, once so powerful, crumbled under the weight of the truth. Principal Harris, faced with mounting pressure, announced a series of reforms. The Legacy Scholarship was reinstated, and the school committed to creating a more inclusive environment. A new committee, led by students and faculty, was formed to ensure transparency in all awards and recognitions. For the first time in years, Wellington Academy began to change. A month later, Emma stood on the auditorium stage once again, this time for a special assembly. The room was filled with students, teachers, and alumni who had come to celebrate the school's new direction. Mr. Harris approached the podium, his expression solemn but sincere. Today, we recognize a student whose courage and determination have inspired us all. Emma Johnson, please come forward. Emma rose, her heart pounding as she walked to the stage. Mr. Harris handed her a plaque that read, Wellington Academy's Legacy of Excellence Award, presented to Emma Johnson for outstanding leadership and advocacy. The crowd erupted into applause. Emma looked out at the sea of faces, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. She had fought for this moment, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been overlooked and underestimated. As the applause died down, Emma stepped up to the microphone. This award isn't just mine, she said, her voice steady. It belongs to everyone who believed in me, who stood by me, and who fought for what's right. Together, we've proven that truth and justice will always win. In the months that followed, Emma's story became a symbol of resilience and change. She was invited to speak at conferences and events, sharing her journey and advocating for equity in education. Wellington Academy, once a place of hidden prejudice, began to embrace its true legacy, a legacy of inclusion and opportunity. And as Emma walked across the stage at graduation, the cheers of her classmates and the pride in her parents' eyes told her one thing. She had changed the world, starting with Wellington Academy.